Hello, and welcome to our sixth Fireside Reflection. You might have noticed we're in a new place.
New place, new location.
New location. So
during these times, you kind of have to adapt and
have to be flexible.
Be flexible and move. What
have
happened?
to be flexible. So we went over to church to our normal fireside, and the internet was down. So we grabbed everything and ran over here, and our engineer was able to set us up here in our living room. So welcome to our home.
Welcome to our home.
On this
and thanks,
fireside
Scott, for adapting.
Thanks again to Scott. So
being our production engineer.
Sure. Last week, we read to you from the final chapter of the Gospel of John. And so we thought it would be interesting to read to you today from the first gospel that was written, which is the Gospel of Mark. And Mark is kind of seen as maybe just a little bit more authoritative than the others because he was first. And Matthew and Luke knew of Mark's gospel and referred to it for their own gospels for checking facts and things. So it's a really interesting chapter. So
yeah. Well, and Mark in general too is earlier a little bit earlier in time, and it was also understood to be a little bit more primitive, a little bit more basic.
Just the details.
Luke more educated. Mark.
Yeah.
Just
the details. Let's get it out there. So we're reading from the 16th chapter, starting with the 9th verse. The first 8 verses tell the resurrection story in the exact same manner that Matthew and Luke and John do. So we didn't want to repeat that. So we thought we'd focus on the second part. So now when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who heard that Jesus was alive, and they would not believe it. After this, Jesus formed to 2 of them as they were walking into the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they didn't believe them. Afterward, Jesus appeared to the 11 themselves as they sat at table, and he upbraided them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover." So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went forth and preached everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that attended it. There you have it.
There you have it. That's Mark.
So much.
Yeah.
Again, we like to do this to you. So much to talk about. So where do you want to start, Paul?
I think we'll start at the beginning. It's a very good place to start.
So true.
So in verse 9, just one of the very quick things is it says that he rose early on the first day of the week, and the first day is
Sunday.
So the first day is Sunday. Next thing it mentions, kind of in passing a little bit, it seems, is Mary Magdalene. He appeared first to Mary Magdalene. So Mary Magdalene, there's actually a lot about her. So just like they call Jesus of Nazareth, Mary Magdalene was not her last name, but it was where she was from. She was from the town of Magdala. And there had been a lot of kind of speculation about Magdala, and where was it, and was it real, and all that.
That there was a prominent town. Know where it was. They had general ideas where it was.
Kind of general ideas.
Really
but an interesting thing happened, and this is where it's very, very strange. Where here we are in 2020, And where it seems like we're incredibly removed from what was happening way, way, way back then. The weird thing is that in many, many cases, we actually know more, almost like firsthand information than people have for nearly the last 2,000 years.
That's
And
true.
when it comes to Magdala,
Yeah,
there was a
so
fascinating thing
fascinating history with Magdala. So in 2006, I think we talked about this a little bit in a previous fireside chat, where the Israeli Antiquities Department, which is a federal program, as soon as you find anything that looks archaeological in nature, you have to stop whatever you're doing
happened.
and call them, and they come
Yeah.
out and investigate, because everywhere in Israel is an archaeological
Yeah.
site.
I mean, it's nearly impossible to dig anywhere.
Yeah.
Right.
So in 2006, somebody was digging, and they came across,
and they were
they stopped.
They're digging a gas station and a hotel.
Well, that was 2000. So
2006 to find it first of all.
2006. So, yeah. Okay. They were digging a hotel and a
Anyway,
gas
so
station.
go ahead.
So,
Yep.
and they came across a archaeological site. So they stopped digging, and they called the Antiquities, and they came down and they started digging, and they found a Hellenistic community. And they were like, oh, that's really interesting, but there are a lot of those in Israel, but we should just keep digging because, it looks like a fairly complete type of site. So they kept
They always
digging.
have to choose at what
where they're
level
gonna
do they
stop.
stop digging. Because if you stop digging at this level, you find one era of history. If you stop digging at this level, you find another era. And you keep going down. It's like, well, what do we need? What are we destroying in order to possibly find what's underneath?
Yeah.
So they
take specific sections and they dig further down to see, is what we have on top better than what's underneath, or what are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
So they kept digging, and they discovered another town underneath that, and that was in 2009. And we actually, our first trip, we were there when they drove us by and said, they think that they found.
Just discovered a new site. Yeah. And they think at that point, which was really exciting to be there at that point in time, where they said, like, we think we may have found the town of Magdala.
So the excavation continued, and they actually found a menorah, the oldest menorah still now ever to be found, and lots of evidence. I had a symbol on it of Migdal, which is the Hebrew name of the town, and so they knew that they had literally found Magdala, the home of Mary Magdalene, which is crazy.
And so when we took our last group that was there, which was last May, we went to Magdala actually for the first time because before it hadn't been excavated yet. So it was really excavated back then. And what they have found is that it was a very wealthy fishing village. And you think, how could a fishing village be wealthy? Well, if there's one fresh body of fresh water in Israel where they can do all the fishing for the entire country, that's where that is. And so you're feeding, they were feeding the entire country. And what they would do is they would catch the fish, they would salt the fish. So they, as a town, they're exporting everything, and which gives them a lot of money. And they found evidence of that.
Yeah, they found the stones that they would salt the fish on and leave them out in the sun to dry. And
floors, which then also
Beautiful.
it's just like one of the many kind of signals that the town had a lot of money, which actually has to do with Mary. The interesting thing is many interesting things about Mary. So, we're all familiar with her name, for one thing, which we kind of take for granted. And we forget how important that is because she's mentioned in all four Gospels. And Jesus has, as we know, the 12 disciples, we know their names. And then a lot of times it mentions, his followers. So he had hundreds of followers. She in particular is mentioned, not being one of the 12 disciples, but in all four Gospels. And she's also identified as the first one who Jesus appeared to on Easter morning on that first day of the week. So, and she's mentioned, when she's mentioned elsewhere, she's mentioned really as one of his companions. So she would go around with him, she would follow him, which really isn't surprising. Well, it's shocking in many ways. It's not surprising geographically, because like if the Sea of Galilee is like this, Capernaum is down here, Magdala is right over here, Tiberias is right over here. There's nothing on this side. So her town was really right next to the town, and Jesus lived in Capernaum. Close. But the shocking thing about her is a woman at all. Not
Very against the culture.
Very completely against the culture. Women weren't. They literally weren't acknowledged. They weren't counted. They weren't counted in the census. The census would only count men.
Well, and we know that in another story of the miracle of the feeding of 5,000, where it says, and Jesus fed 5,000, not including women and children.
Yeah, so they did 5,000 men, which they
literally
mean men, not men and
just
women.
didn't count.
Yeah, so they literally didn't count. And legally, women's testimony, a woman could firsthand see a murder or something like that, and her testimony was thrown out in court. It wouldn't even be entertained in court. So they were considered as being completely without honor or respect. And yet you go, wow, she is a prominent person among Jesus's followers and within the Gospels. And you go, why would they include that if they're trying to present a convincing argument and so forth? And it's one of the zillions of reasons why they say you wouldn't put this in unless
Right.
unless it happened.
Did you know? Yeah. Good. And there are some interesting things about Mary Magdalene that you can find out when you do your detective work in the four Gospels. And one of the things, because Magdala was such a wealthy community, there is the presumption then that she was wealthy. Well, you can't really make that presumption based just on the fact that somebody comes from a wealthy community. So what other evidence was there? Well, if you go back to the birth story, and that Mary was married off as a young child, which was common to do when Jesus's mother, was married off as a young child, which was common to do when the father had left and there was no financial support of the family. So we know that Mary Magdalene was a woman who lived on her own. There's no mention of a husband or any sort of thing. So the only women that could do that were women of means. So another clue that she had money is that she anointed Jesus's feet with oil, and that oil was incredibly expensive. And the disciples wanted to send that off, type of thing, and use it to feed the poor, type of thing. And then the other, it's kind of understood that she maybe underwrote a lot of, financially supported, was a benefactor.
And Jesus had benefactors. He had, he had people financially supporting him, which is not surprising. But so through a lot of research, it's understood that she was one of the many benefactors.
Yeah. But what she wasn't was a prostitute.
Yeah.
And that was actually a bit of, here's where conspiracy theories come in. That was a bit of an intentional act to discredit her and to bring her value down, because again, she was the first person to see the resurrected
I'll give the
Christ.
early church fathers graciously bending over backwards to give them the benefit of the
You're more gracious than I.
Maybe it would be an unconscious move, since their entire culture discredited women, but they conflated the other stories of her and Mary of Bethany, and there was another Mary, and even though there's zero in the scriptures to indicate at all that Mary of Magdalene was a prostitute, that she was branded really by the early church fathers. I forgot which one in particular, but I think it was in the 2 to maybe 300s, but I think maybe in the 200s, to brand her as a prostitute. And why would they do that? To, I hate to say it, but to build up the influence of men, to reduce the influence of women and Jesus's respect and relationships with women. And that would also, I hate to say, that would also help to kind of sell, the Gospels, because it was so, Jesus's relationship with women was so, I can't even call it progressive, because it was like in a different universe, progressive compared to what was going on, that that they probably,
Very uncomfortable.
tamped that down, because it made so many men very, very uncomfortable.
Yep, and similar to at Christmas time, I always like to ask the question, how many wise men were they? And everyone says 3. And how do you know? What does the Bible say? And it's like, I don't know. I guess it says 3. And you go and you look, and the Bible actually says that wise men came from the east. It doesn't say 3.
Yep.
How do we get the 3? From that beautiful hymn, We Three Kings. Same with Mary Magdalene. Where do you, modern culturists, since you're not really reading necessarily into the Bible and finding out about who Mary Magdalene is, where do you get that notion of her being being that person? Is from Godspell, the musical Godspell, and that beautiful song, I Don't Know How to Love Him. And so it's
and from 1500 years, and
Yeah,
1500 years of
1500 years of-
tradition
right.
of church, and they were the church fathers, of perpetuating this. And why didn't people just read the Bible themselves and check it out? Because for the first, like, one Bible per town, because valuable, it's tens of thousands of hours of work to go into one document. So people
and they weren't
physically
literate.
didn't have, so A, they're not literate, B, even if they were literate, you can't physically get your hands on, so you have to believe what the people are telling you.
Yeah.
So that's really just the first line about Mary Magdalene. The interesting thing is, when you get to the second verse, verse 10, is that it says that she saw this, and then she went and told those who had been with him for mourning and weeping. So another interesting thing about Mary Magdalene is that she is faithful. She's actually always portrayed as being faithful, and always as believing.
Mm-hmm.
And not so for the disciples, which is fascinating. So, and especially in comparison to then, these next several verses, which talks about the disciples, not believing, and then a different group of disciples, they weren't believing yet. And then, right off the bat, though, she did believe, and she told.
Yeah, I mean, she was a foundational person in this whole divine story. Without her, it wouldn't have happened. And of course, I like to uphold the fact that the first people that Jesus told, first people to see him, were women.
True.
And and the men had a history of not believing and not understanding.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, Thomas not seeing, not believing, then Thomas seeing and believing. And then you have Jesus saying, well, blessed are those who don't see, but who believe. And Mary Magdalene believing, seeing, or not seeing, just an instant believer.
Very, very faithful.
Yeah.
Very faithful.
Yeah. She's a fabulous part of the story.
And then
she
you
disappears
compare that-
after this too. Paul doesn't write about her, which is really too bad. So we don't know what happened to her after this story, but
so, and then we
What a
compare that
legacy.
to verse 11, where it says, so she went and told the disciples, and it says they heard that Jesus was alive, that she had seen him, and then for the disciples, they did not believe it.
they would
So
not.
they didn't believe her.
No.
They were also taught not to believe women. You
Yeah.
don't believe, idle tales, according to their culture.
Yeah.
And then fascinating verse 12 is the words, afterward Jesus appeared in a different form. So this is where it gets kind of touchy. With Orthodox Christianity, we talk about the resurrected Jesus, and Orthodox Christianity says he appeared, in the body, exactly, the way he looked, everything that was his body. This in the gospel says specifically he's in a different form. That presents a problem with when you have something that's in the Bible that doesn't agree with doctrine that was created later. You can take that to mean what you want. Actually, when I was in seminary, I remember, bringing this up with professors, and they said, well, maybe he was not with a specific verse, but with other verses when he appears in a different, where it seems like he's in a different form, where they didn't recognize it, but it doesn't say so specifically that he was in a different form. And they said, well, maybe they were in shock or whatever. Well, this says he's in a different form. And so that kind of brings up the question of, what are they, what's this, what's the resurrection about? And I think it's a great question of faith that it poses, because this all has to do about faith. There's nothing that's undermining or anything. So I think that it's our job to take what's there and to try to figure out how we receive it, instead of trying to make it something else, because this is the gospel.
Well, and you have the doctrine of sola scriptura, so the scripture only. And when scripture and doctrine disagree in the Protestant faith, scripture is going to win out.
Yeah.
And it's very clear. After this, he appeared in another form to two of them as they were walking in the country. And we told you that story last week, and that's what they're referring to is Cleopas and his traveling companion who were walking on the way to Emmaus. And they didn't recognize him until they sat and broke bread with him. And then for some reason, they were then able to understand who he was. And then in that story that we told last week, they go back to the disciples. They tell the story. They say, we've seen him, we've been with him, and those darn disciples still.
But it was
Tough
only
times.
after eating. So, here they are. They're having this whole conversation face to face until it gets dark. So what it's saying is for hours they're talking with him and they don't recognize him. And that also relates back to this, somehow in a mysterious kind of a different form. And then it goes into verse 13. And it says, these, so the ones then who did see him, it uses the word they a lot, and you have to figure out what group of people are you talking about, and with using the they. So then there's a different group of disciples who it was reported, this was reported to, and it says, and they didn't believe him. So again, it's fascinating with the Gospels, who is saying, look, we're just going to share with you what happened. We're not going to try to convince you. We're not going to try to have it make logical sense. Look, if it makes sense, it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, I'm just going to tell you what I saw. And I'm not going to cut out things that maybe seemed, a little unbelievable. And it's fascinating that the Gospels would be presenting the disciples, the most faithful, as people who, at first, this group didn't believe it. That group didn't believe it. So it took them time to act together. That's a bold thing to do with a document that you're sharing, saying, believe this. And to me, this gives it so much more credibility to just say, look, we're just presenting it as it is. It may not be pretty. We're presenting, women and roles of authority. And even though that's not just unpopular, but it's actually illegal, we're presenting it anyway.
But it also makes the stories very human and really speaks to our humanity, because I think that we can all resonate with the disciples. I think we all, can understand, like, this is an unbelievable thing to have happen. And so it kind of gives us some comfort as well within ourselves. And then when you go on to verse 14, where it says, afterward, Jesus appeared to the 11 themselves. So now he's in there with his remaining 11 disciples as they sat at a table.
And he's praising them, right? No,
No, I was like, I don't know. That's not the story. Yeah, and he upbraided them for their unbelief and hardness of heart,
Right.
which that's interesting. So for their unbelief, which you get like, oh, come on, I told you this was going to happen. You promised you wouldn't deny me. You promised I believe the words at the Last Supper where, I will never betray you until the ends of the type of thing. So there's that question of unbelief, but then, which is, I think that where these people who have
Right.
seen him come and say, he's alive, we're trying to give you the, and like Pharaoh, they would not hear the message.
Which is
Their
saying,
hearts were hardened.
right, and it's saying, so how do we believe? We believe on two levels. That we believe, there's the logical, linear, cognitive, belief, and he's talking about this belief down here, where sometimes there are, as we know in our own lives, there are things that, regardless of what's happening here, we might be drawn, or we may shut down our hearts. When we see, poor people on the street and they're suffering, in order to not help them, you have to shut down your heart. And I know that every single person has experienced that. I mean, I've experienced that. You know what that feels like to shut it down, and you know what it feels like to to open that up. And that's not just a way of believing, that's a way of living. And that's really where, that's what he wants. He doesn't necessarily want our minds. Yes, that's good. He wants our hearts, and our hearts to open, because it's not that he wants it for himself, but he wants what's good for us. And when our heart is open, we feel better. We experience life more full blast, all of it. But it is interesting, again, that he says this when it is A, strange, rebuking the disciples, B, it's not smooth. This is not a smooth, well integrated, beautiful, seamless story. It's rough, it's embarrassing in parts, and third, but it's so authentic, because that's what love does. Sometimes love does say, hey, I'm so disappointed, I'm so hurt, here I was for you, and where were you? And that's just authentic. And to me, that opens up my heart, just the authenticity of that.
Well, and I think that there's one more part in it too, of the fact that, so you have to remember that there were all these beings who are operating with the living Christ, who have come to them to not live out a story, but to unveil God, to open their hearts in the way of showing them what the living manifestation of God embodies and inhabits. Then going forth to tell them to go out and spread that message, and to take that within their hearts. And I think that part of that not believing is the self-denial of themselves and that transmission that they had received, and then also their calling forth. That it's not just this like not believing in Jesus; it's the actual closing of their heart to the divine, and to their really significant individualized functions.
And as we talked about last week, I mean, so much so that they just went back to their lives and went fishing. Like they totally shut down and totally denied. And
even though rationally, they knew, but it wasn't that kind of leap of faith. And that's really what our faith is all about. It's not, I mean, Machiavellian would be, if it were Machiavellian, it would be like, look, this is to your advantage, and here's the reasons why, and we're going to give you all these logical reasons and stuff. And you go, okay, well, sure, I'll be a person of faith, because this is good for me, and it all makes sense, and I'll help people, and that's good for the community and stuff. It's like, no, that's not what it's about. It's about being loving, and sometimes loving, pushes you, to that next level. It's like when people figure out, having babies, and how much do babies cost? What's the cost of a child? And kind of, if you add it up that way, then you can go, this doesn't, I mean, it doesn't make financial sense to have a child. It's, when we're not living on farms anymore and having children to help with the workload, it doesn't make financial sense. That's not why you have children. You have children for love, to open your heart.
And I think that kind of brings us to our last line here. Because after he sits with them and he upbraids them, he then says to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. And that's, what is the gospel? The good news. What is the good news? That God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that whoever believes in him may have life eternal. Like, the good news is love. Love is here. Love is found. Love is everywhere. And I think it's great to leave this thought with you to ponder, that he says to preach the gospel not to all the people, which he has done in the past. He said, go and baptize all the people in the name. But this time he says, preach the gospel to the whole creation.
Yeah.
And
which is funny, because before you pointed this slips by, kind of this slips by when you're just kind of reading it. And that's one little word that never really hit me. And then you brought it up.
Yeah, but not just people, all creation. So bring love to everything. Bring love to the animals. Bring love to trees. Bring love can do as an energy in all of creation. And I think we all know that love is a powerful force that, I mean, we've stopped the world. Many people won't say we've stopped the world because we so love the world that we don't want them to die of this virus. But we've stopped the world because we so love the world that we don't want it to die. Yeah,
and
always.
This also, you know, to creation, to whole creation, brings it also full circle to back to Genesis, back to the very, very beginning of God creating everything and saying, God creating the plants, it was good. The animals, it was good. Creating absolutely every single little bit and saying it was good. And then, interestingly, saying, and you have, and then creating humanity and saying, you have dominion over this. Jesus, the whole beauty of Jesus is he shows us, he's our model, how to have dominion. You know, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is King. And he has dominion. So you can have dominion either by force and saying, well, you know, I've got power over you, so that means that I'm going to make you do whatever I want. Tremendous love, tremendous respect, you know, grace, sacrifice with forgiveness, with all of that. That's how we love creation. That's the whole message. And so you can't honor Jesus and trash creation.
Right.
It just it doesn't go, you know, it doesn't go hand in hand.
And you can't,
So so it's a beautiful, you know, it's yet another, you know, yet another level. And
Scott has one more thought.
We actually had a
so
question.
We were talking about
Dave.
Oh, we have a question coming.
So last week we were talking with Scott, and he was saying, you know, sometimes if I have a thought or whatever, if we have a question, you know, can I chime in? Like, absolutely. But
yes. Now we have a question from afar.
So this is a question from Dave. He says, wondering what the Gnostic Gospel of Mary says about her discipleship after Jesus's death, even though Paul doesn't say anything about her.
Yeah, that's a whole.
That's a whole nother talk. Good question, Dave.
It's a great question. There's the Gospel of Mary is problematic because there are, you know, with the Gospels that were not incorporated into the canon, into the, you know, recognized. Why are they officially recognized? Because like witnesses in a courtroom, you know, you could have 10 witnesses, but if 9 of them saying something completely different, then not that Mary wasn't reliable about this source, where if you read the Gospel of Mary, you go, you know, yes, yes, yes. What? That sounds really strange. That's not like, you know, the Jesus that we, you know, understand that's been described in the Gospels. And so kind of in short, that's why they threw out Mary. So that's not exactly answering your question directly, but I'd have to go back and read specifically.
Yeah, it's been some seminary.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a little while. So, but those are great questions, and those are the type of things that for each one of you, that if you, let's say, if you are curious about Magdala, the town of Magdala, now you don't have to go to a seminary library. Now you can just go online and you can look up Magdala, and you can see all sorts of, you know, from archaeology
times. Yeah.
and so forth. You can read about that. You can check out the Gospel of Mary, research and check out that, that specific strain of it.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I need to leave that question kind of open because,
But let us
because
know,
I
Dave.
don't-
Do your
because I
research
don't
and come
know.
back to us and let us
I
know.
don't know that. And
That's
I don't
great.
mind saying I don't know.
Yeah. And the only magazine I subscribe to is Biblical Archaeology. And it's a fabulous magazine, but it also has an online presence. And the story of Magdala is online there with Biblical Archaeology. So you can see the pictures. It's just stunningly beautiful.
So once again, wonder about it, wrestle with it, ask questions. Sometimes we know, sometimes it's an area that we don't know. And if I don't know, I'm not going to make it up or anything. So that I would do research, or you can do research, and that's the beauty of it. And so what we were really dealing with was seven verses, just 7 verses.
Yeah.
And
We thought we were gonna
there's
get to
that
the-
much, and I feel still like we're still kind of skimming the surface with a half an hour on 7 verses. So so keep your studying, keep your thinking, keep your hearts open, and I'll keep our hearts open. We'll be constantly working on keeping my heart open.
Yeah.
So
Perfect.
wrap it up.
Sure.
All right. How about if we wrap it up with the Lord's Prayer? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Thank you. Hope you have a
Thanks for
wonderful day.
joining us from home. Yeah, enjoy the day.
All right. God bless you.